Hi everyone, so my name's Niamh and I'm a psychology and sociology student at UL, and this is my FYP project, Coping During COVID-19, Your Personality and Your Mental Wellbeing. So my research kind of had two key investigations that I looked at. The first was the role of extroversion in mental well-being during a pandemic. I'll go into what extroversion actually means in a minute, but there has been previous research that shows that extroversion is usually a positive predictor of mental well-being. So our aim was to look at whether this remained the case during a pandemic. The second then part of the research was whether this was a direct relationship. So if a person was extroverted, it increased their chances of having positive mental well-being. Or was there something else at play, like maybe the possibility that extroverted people use certain coping strategies that then influence their mental well-being? So that was they were the kind of two key investigations we wanted to look at. So just some of the key terms then, some of them I've referred to already. So extroversion is a personality trait that's part of the Big Five model that is used often in psychology. So it's a personality trait that a person who's high on extroversion enjoys being around people. They're quite enthusiastic and talkative. But really the main thing is that they thrive when they're around others. So that kind of makes it interesting as a personality trait to look at in the context of a pandemic because of that lack of social interaction that we're all experiencing at the moment. Then mental well-being, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, it's basically just a level of positive affect and experience of happiness that allows for adequate psychological functioning and general everyday functioning as well. And coping strategies are like conscious efforts that people make to deal with a situation of distress. So they vary from person to person, and we'll look at four specifically in this study. Then mediation is actually the type of analysis that was used, specifically a parallel mediation. But what it really looks at is a relationship, but also other factors that might be at play in that relationship. So in this case, it was extroversion and mental well-being, the relationship. And what we looked at was whether coping strategies played any role in this relationship. So I mentioned there the Big Five model of personality, and I'm just going to explain briefly the other traits that are involved because they actually do become relevant later on. So openness is, if a person is high on openness, they value variety, and they're quite open to new experience and have quite an open mind and an active imagination, and they value like cultural things and are generally quite curious. A conscientious person then is quite diligent and approaches things quite efficiently, and they take their responsibility to others and obligations to others quite seriously. As I mentioned, extroversion is real social personality traits, so that people who thrive around being around others and like a certain themselves. Agreeableness then is a person who's quite warm and friendly and is generally trusting of other people and human nature in general. So they don't really like conflict. They like getting along with people. Finally, then, neuroticism. If someone's high on neuroticism, they tend to be quite irritable. They can also be emotionally sensitive or self-conscious and could show like some anxious and depressive feelings as well. So then when we looked at coping strategies as well. So you can see we divided the coping strategies up into adaptive and maladaptive strategies. So two of the adaptive strategies there have had a self-sufficient element. So what that means is that people are able to implement these strategies by themselves. They don't need any advice or help from others. So the first one there is self-sufficient, problem focused. And if you were to implement that strategy, you would focus on the stressful situation or the problem at hand and try manipulate it, adapt it so it makes it less stressful and better for you. Emotion focus then is to the ability to regulate your emotions properly, any emotions that might have come due to this stressful situation. So your ability to regulate them to make your situation better. Then socially supported coping involves turning to others for either instrumental or emotional advice in a stressful situation. So that one is quite important for highly extroverted people due to the fact that they do really like being around people. Finally, then, the maladaptive strategy we looked at was avoidant coping, and someone who uses avoidant coping would tend to disengage from a situation psychologically and behaviourally. They could use substances such as drugs and alcohol to kind of get themselves out of a situation, but not really addressing it head on at all. So the hypotheses we tested, the first one was extraversion positively predicts mental well-being during periods of restrictions during COVID-19 pandemic. So extraversion has been shown to positively predict mental well-being in general, but we want to see if this remains the case when we're under severe restrictions, when that social element is removed and we're in a pandemic situation as well. Then extroverted people use more adaptive coping strategies. So they've been shown to use more the 3 adaptive strategies. So specifically the socially supported strategy. So we want to see if this remains the case during a pandemic. And finally, then the coping and strategies employed play a part in this positive relationship between extroversion and mental well-being. So just some of the literature that informed the hypotheses. So COVID-19 is predicted to have a significant impact on mental health generally, and so that makes it quite relevant and worth looking into. Research on disaster situations previously has shown that people who turn to social support tend to have better mental health outcomes. So that makes COVID-19 quite a unique situation because we don't have that same access. So we're trying to see whether people are still turning to social support or maybe using different strategies. Coping has been shown to account of a lot of variation in mental health outcomes. So certain strategies predict better mental health. Then similarly, personality factors also predict better or worse mental health outcomes. And then there has been evidence of this triadic relationship between personality, coping and mental well-being. So we just aim to investigate that further in the context of this pandemic as well. So just the methods and the data collection. So we had 243 participants in an online survey. There was 4 sections to the survey. The first was the Big 5 inventory, which was the personality measure. The second we used then was the brief coping scale. So that measured the 4 coping strategies. And then finally the Warwick-Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. And then we had a final section on demographics that actually just really asked some basic information such as age and gender. So this is a visualization of the mediation model. So just maybe to explain it a bit more. So the direct relationship we were interested in was that relationship between extraversion and mental well-being. And you can see then the 4 coping strategies were added to the model to see did they have any impact. So we did find a direct effect of extraversion on mental well-being, but some of the mediating effects weren't as expected. So we'll go into that a bit more as well. So the main findings were that trait extraversion was positively related to mental well-being. So this reflected previous research. So despite the fact we were in a pandemic and extroverts didn't have that same access to social support or just social contact generally, they still the traits still did predict more positive mental well-being. But interestingly, people generally throughout the sample use more self-sufficient coping mechanisms. So this just does suggest it kind of deviates from previous research, because usually in disaster situations, people turn to that social support, the community, their friends, their family. But it's showing that in this pandemic, people are using more of the self-sufficient problem focus and the self-sufficient emotion focus strategies. This then is reflected in that relationship between extraversion and mental well-being, because where social support did play such a big role in this relationship, it wasn't actually shown as a significant mediator of the relationship in this study. So self-sufficient emotion-focused coping was actually the only significant mediator. And then finally, another kind of deviating but interesting finding was that we repeated the parallel mediation analysis with the other personality traits being controlled for. So the 4 that I mentioned earlier, apart from extraversion. And when we did this, the the effect between extroversion and mental well-being was actually no longer present. So what that suggested to us was that there actually might be more overlap with the personality traits than we originally thought. So when any influence that, say, agreeableness, conscientiousness had on extroversion, or any similarity was removed, the effect was no longer present. So that kind of adds another interesting dimension and shows how complex the relationship actually is. So just some brief conclusions then. Extroversion remains to predict positive mental well-being even during a pandemic situation. There's been a shift towards more self-sufficient forms of coping, and that's probably due to the lack of access to social support. And then there's a mediating effect of self-sufficient emotion-focused coping. So the tendency of an extrovert to be able to regulate their emotions effectively is what actually, plays a role or accounts for a portion of the relationship with mental well-being. And then we do need to question the directness of this relationship, or the nature of true extroversion, and whether there's more overlap with other personality traits than we originally know, maybe initiating some research into the reliability of this model that we use quite frequently. So thank you for listening, and there's just some tips there to cope with COVID-19. Thank you very much, and there's some references there as well.